From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Tuesday edition, as House Republicans look across the divide to the upper chamber to find President Trump's big, beautiful bill. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. An important day here in the nation's capital, Kailey. We're about to learn a lot about what stays in and what might come out of this bill with action on both sides of the Capitol.
Yeah, of course, some of that being driven by senators who want changes, some of it being driven by procedure in the Senate parliamentarian, which is going to rule what can and cannot be included in this bill for budgetary purposes. That is something the House is going to have to grapple with when things return to that chamber, and we're going to speak more about that this hour with the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, who, of course, had pretty difficult time hammering out the tax details in the House the first go-around. Jason Smith is going to be with us in just a few minutes.
I can only imagine what's going through his head right now as they wait for changes to come back from the Senate, but important, the Rules Committee is going to get together on the House side about an hour from now, Kailey, in an attempt to maybe tweak some of this language to make it more palatable to the Senate. We'll get a sense from the chairman about what that might include. In
the meantime, we're still waiting to get a sense of the progress being made in London as U.S. and China trade talks continue for a second day. Negotiators right now, Joe, are on a break. Taking some time for dinner, going to return at 8 p.m. local time to try and hammer out the technical details of this agreement that we initially thought was reached in Geneva last month.
You got to think that means progress if they're not calling it a night. And suggest we could have some news on the late edition of Balance of Power, but not for a few more hours as they get dinner, to your point right now, in a late session for U.S.-China talks, all part of our program today.
Of course, markets, just like all of us here in Washington, are eagerly awaiting news out of London to see if an actual agreement or re-agreement, shall we say, can be reached between the U.S. and China as high-level negotiators are continuing later this evening to try to hammer out the details of this trade agreement. The principals, of course, taking a dinner break for now. They're expected to reconvene at 8 p.m. local time, 3 p.m. Eastern, Joe. So this could go well into late afternoon here in the U.S. before we get any kind of readout.
Could be an all-nighter, I guess. Theoretically, Howard Lutnick, on his way to a break earlier, said talks have been fruitful. They are trying to be optimistic here, whether they're close to something, a re-agreement. I like what you came up with there, because we're really just going back a couple of weeks in time, not even as far as Liberation Day. So if they get through this now, rare earths, batteries, and the rest, that would potentially unlock larger talks on actual reciprocal tariffs, you like to think?
Yeah, considering we are up against a mid-August deadline for all of that to be.
Clock's ticking on a lot of stuff around here, not just reconciliation. We're going to get to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in just a moment. First, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall covering the White House for us with the latest on talks and the latest from the president. Tyler, this could go well into the evening here. Donald Trump, I'm sure, is waiting for news, but this would be just the beginning.
Right, exactly. We have to think about what the objectives of this round of talks are. As you're alluding to, we're not really expecting tariffs to come down during these talks in London, but really we're trying to get both sides to feel comfortable that they're both respecting the agreement that was outlined in Geneva. Really at the heart of that is export controls, as both sides accuse each other of ramping up restrictions on products that they rely on. Now, yesterday, I asked President Trump at the White House if he had given his negotiating team any sort of limits when it comes to export controls. And he was a little non-committal, but he didn't rule anything out. But it's important because at the end of the day, we're going to have to see if there is this willingness from the United States part to ultimately lift some of these restrictions that they've put into place. Now, people familiar do tell Bloomberg News that this would likely be those most recent restrictions on the software that goes into AI chips, the jet engines, things like that have recently been imposed. But of course, the key sticking here, Joe and Kailey, is that the U.S. needs to see assurances that China is going to ramp up and speed up those export licenses when it comes to critical minerals.
Well, and this was the nature of a lot of our conversations we were having with trade experts yesterday, that the U.S. has actual national security considerations that it needs to take into account when it's deciding what export controls to lift, whereas China can just kind of turn the critical mineral switch on and off at will. How does the U.S. guarantee that China sticks to its word?
Exactly. Also, when you look at how China controls 70% of the world's production when it comes to rare earths that are so essential to these supply chains. Of course, this goes hand in hand with the broader administration's goal when they talk about de-risking instead of decoupling from China. And there's a lot of focus here on how Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is part of these talks. He wasn't there in Geneva. Of course, the Commerce Department really has the oversight when it comes to these export controls. And that that was seen as a positive step that these things could be on the table. But we should also point out the split screen that we saw last week in Washington, the same day that President Trump had his phone call with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Howard Lutnick was on Capitol Hill telling lawmakers that he actually thinks there needs to be tighter enforcement when it comes to these export controls. So how that's really going to play out, it seems like the Commerce Department is ramping up these talks in that direction.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Thank you so much. And Tyler reminding us of something important, which is that the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who's currently still in London at these talks, is technically scheduled to testify before the House Ways and Means Committee tomorrow morning on the budget for the fiscal year.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we're going to do that.
Yeah.
It does bring us to matters, of course, on Capitol Hill, though. Kailey, and some big questions about what happens to the big, beautiful bill if we are going to be in store for some changes as soon as today.
Indeed. And it's on that note we turn to Capitol Hill now, where we're joined live by the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, the Republican congressman from Missouri, Jason Smith, back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Mr. Chairman, we appreciate you being here on Balance of Power. As we consider the changes that are underway in the Senate, have you been read in to what the Senate parliamentarian is saying needs to be stripped from this package?
Yeah, the Senate parliamentarian has been ruling on various different items. It's really have not been that many, especially when it comes to the tax policy. These are things that we have been very careful that when we were trying to draft the legislation over on the House side, that it would be BERT compliant and be able to follow the rules of reconciliation, and that would fly for the parliamentarian. However, a few things that might have to be changed will be done before we send the final bill over to.
Well, and what are those few
Senate
things, Mr. Chairman? What are they?
We're still waiting for the final analysis, but when it comes to some tax policies that were discussed, for example, provisions that was in the bill that affect non-for-profits that are funding terrorism. That was not a budgetary impact, and so it had to be taken out. It's things like that, nothing of major significance that will alter the bill. The biggest things that I think is still left to be decided by the Senate parliamentarian when it comes to tax policy is eliminating the reemployment tax credit, and also something in regards to Purple Heart designation.
Interesting. Mr. Chairman, I know there's an important Rules Committee meeting on the House side about an hour from now. Will those changes be made in that session so you can do this before it's technically in the hands of the Senate?
I don't serve on the Rules Committee, but it's very possibly those changes will be made before it is released to the Senate. And the Senate is working around the clock on this bill. They've been working with their fellow colleagues over in the Senate and trying to thread the needle that we thread over in the House of Representatives. It's very, very tough to thread that needle when you look at the debt and deficit hawks, that some want to cut more money, others think you're cutting too much. It's the same way with all the green credits. Some folks want the green credits eliminated immediately. Others want to use a scalpel and look at an approach. And it's the same way with the state and local tax deduction. There's some senators over there that they don't like it, but they know that they have to balance it in order to make sure we get 218 in the House and 51 in the Senate.
Well, and it doesn't look like they're stopping at changes to SALT. We've heard talk as well of senators, the Senate looking to make changes to the no tax on tips and overtime measures that were included in the House package. In fact, the Senate Budget Chair, Lindsey Graham, told Semaphore in an interview earlier today that he thinks those things may not fit in this mega bill. Therefore, there might need to be another budget reconciliation package later down the line. And Mr. Chairman, I wonder what your response to that is.
That's a no-go. It would be dead on arrival. The senators need to know that we have followed through. We passed this one big, beautiful bill. It's what the president has asked. They need to do the same thing. There's no reason for those senators to kick the can down the road on priorities that the president campaigned on. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime. These are items that the president spoke at every one of his rallies, and 77 million people voted for him. The House delivered on it. The Senate will deliver on it as well.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we just arrived at one deal breaker in your words here, and I wonder what some of the others are. You hear all the same talk that everybody hears. In fact, I'm sure you know a lot more about it than we do, which is why we're glad to have you with us today. When you talk about changes to SALT, you talk about pulling out the so-called revenge tax, maybe some of the green incentives that are in there. What's the deal breaker on the House side? Because the conventional wisdom we keep hearing is the Freedom Caucus will deal with it if the SALT number stays where it is, for instance, that some of the issues from the more conservative members of the House will have to be dealt with because you need to keep the moderates, the New York, New Jersey, California delegations happy. Am I anywhere close to true on this?
The deal breaker is whenever you get out of balance. We struck a very good balance of passing a bill 215 to 214 in the House of Representatives. You have to thread a very narrow needle, and that's what the deal breaker could be, is if the Senate adjusts it too much one way or the other. You could either lose members of the right flank, or you could lose members on the left flank. And so those are things that we're balancing, and that is what could be fatal. But failure's not an option. We're going to get this done. Leader Thune, Chairman Crapo, they are navigating it over on their side of the building, and they understand the huge dynamics that we have within the House of Representatives. And they're going to make some changes over there, but I don't see those to be mega changes that are going to be catastrophic. It's going to be changes that probably will make the bill better.
Well, what about the change specifically, or the decision to drop the AI regulation moratorium? Have you heard from colleagues in the House as to whether or not that's a deal breaker for any of them?
We've had colleagues in the House that has raised a lot of concerns about it. Of course, that was not in the Ways and Means jurisdiction whenever it was put in, but it's something I think that the Senate, I know that the Senate is definitely addressing.
I'm curious as well about some of the green incentives, Mr. Chairman. There's reporting that more than 30 owners of rural energy companies are swarming the Hill today, knocking on doors. Maybe they've been knocking on yours to urge Republican lawmakers to preserve clean energy tax credits. Let's put EVs aside and the whole Elon Musk conversation. When it comes to wind and solar, if those are restored in the Senate, is that a deal breaker in the House?
So we cut over $500 billion of the green energy credits. This is something that the president called for. This is something that the majority of the House Republicans called for. You have to understand, not one Republican in the House or the Senate voted for these green credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we tried to use a very balanced approach so that it didn't rip the rug from underneath industries that have invested already within the current tax policies, and we figured out a way to phase it out over a period of time. You just have to be balanced. We cannot be extreme in just ripping them away. We cannot be extreme in not taking them away. So it's right in the middle. You have to be right in the middle, and that's what we're doing.
Well, and as you talk about needing to be right in the middle, how this is a very difficult line to walk for both chambers, Mr. Chairman, when we consider the Congressional Budget Office yesterday released another estimate of when the U.S. will reach the X date, when it can no longer fulfill its debt obligations, guessing that could be as soon as mid-August when you and your colleagues are on recess. Can you rule out entirely that the debt ceiling is not going to have to be addressed separately if by the end of July this bill has not worked its way through both chambers? What odds would you put around that?
The House has increased the debt ceiling. We've addressed that in the One Big Beautiful Bill. The Senate needs to act. We have said all along, let's put this bill on the president's desk by July 4th, and then you have nothing to worry about. The Senate trying to break different items in 15 different bills is a no-go. We have delivered in the House. They need to deliver in the Senate.
Mr. Chairman, I wonder if you've had a chance to speak with Elon Musk or any of his allies since he took a position of opposition on this bill, and whether he's giving members of the Freedom Caucus or anyone in the Republican conference in the House, or for that matter, Republicans in the Senate, cover to vote no.
Let me just say this. The bill that we passed, the One Big Beautiful Bill, is the largest cut to spending in the history of our country, almost $1.7 trillion. With all the great work that Elon and Doge has done in cutting, they cut $175 billion in 5 months. The bill that we passed out of the House cut $1.69 trillion. Could we cut more? I would love to cut more, but it's still the largest cut in the history of America. And that's what I like to point out. Whenever people try to use the accounting measure saying that it's going to add $2+ trillion to the deficit, I believe that that is funny math, because what they are referring to is existing tax policy is going to cost roughly $4 trillion. And that's not the case. Our revenues into this country right now is 17.2% of GDP. And if you look at the historic level over the last 50 years, revenues to GDP has been right at 17%. We don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem.
Well, finally, Mr. Chairman, on the revenue side, tariffs, of course, factor into that equation. And just quickly, we have a minute left here on tariffs. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is currently still in London working on trade negotiations with China that are expected to go late into the night local time. Are you still expecting him before the committee for his testimony tomorrow morning?
I am still expecting him before the committee. It looks like he may have a long night, but I'm grateful for the work that he's doing, Howard Lutnick and Ambassador Greer is doing, because they are working and representing the United States when it comes to China and all the other countries coming to the table to make sure that the American worker, American manufacturer, and American farmer is treated fairly on a world stage.
You may need stronger coffee tomorrow morning, Mr. Chairman. This ought to be interesting.
Energy drinks for them.
I guess. All right, I guess we lost Congressman Jason Smith, Republican chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. Wanted that last word. We'll assemble our panel next. Yeah, okay. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are on the way in here on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
Meantime, we're keeping you up to date on the continuing drama over protests in Los Angeles, where, of course, we've seen the deployment of another 2,000 National Guard members after the initial 2,000 members deployed over the weekend. And, of course, 700 Marines, active duty Marines, have now arrived in Los Angeles as well, as President Trump describes that as an effort necessary to keep Los Angeles from burning and to control the activity we're seeing. But he also said in the Oval Office, while speaking to reporters in the last hour, that he spoke with California's Governor Gavin Newsom a day ago. To quote the president, called him up to tell him, got to do a better job. He's doing a bad job. To which the governor is now responding, there was no call. Joe, he says, not even a voicemail.
Yeah, Gavin Newsom going on to write that Americans should be alarmed that a president deploying Marines onto our streets doesn't even know who he is talking to. Kind of taking a page from Trump, the way he talks about Joe Biden. Let's assemble our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are on board with us today, back together for the first time in over a week. Rick is our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and Bloomberg Politics contributor. Jeanne, we keep hearing that this is good politics for Donald Trump. This seems like it's pretty good politics for Gavin Newsom, too. What do you think?
It is. And, you know, I share Gavin Newsom's use of the word alarm, but probably not for the same reason he's using it. I am alarmed that a president would say just minutes ago in the Oval Office that if you're going to protest on the 250th anniversary, you will be met with heavy force, without differentiating that peaceful protest is one of the linchpins of being an American, our right to speak and assemble. I'm alarmed that he would send troops in without being asked by the governor, but I'm also alarmed on the Democratic side that they are playing into this theatricality. The reality is that we do need a solution to immigration. And the kind of solution we need is not this performative back and forth of, you know, our leaders on social media yelling at each other. It is a legislation out of Congress, like Rick's former boss, John McCain, put together. That's what we need. And what's alarming is we are nowhere close to there. And oh, by the way, we have a director of Homeland Security who went on TV last night and said everybody in LA is a criminal. That kind of performative nonsense is not what we need. We need solutions.
Well, when we consider the performance, if you will, Rick, and the continued escalation we see, President Trump was asked in the Oval Office by a reporter if he would consider invoking the Insurrection Act. And he said, if there's an insurrection, I will invoke the Insurrection Act. That, of course, would carve out what is not allowed thanks to the Posse Comitatus Act, which is the U.S. military acting in a law enforcement capacity. Do you really believe the president would go there?
You know, it's hard to tell in these circumstances. You know, he gets a question, he feels like he's got to answer the question. And I thought it was actually pretty non-committal. But look, I mean, the difference between the Marines going to California and protecting the assets of the federal government, you know, courthouses and federal government centers where some of the deportees are being held, that's one thing. But then, you know, basically them acting as a police squad in any jurisdiction of America is going to have a different reaction. Right now, we're debating whether or not a phone call was made or who asked for what. In that case, when you take that kind of constitutional action where you suspend Posse Comitatus, I think you would see a national dialogue erupt of epic proportions, because you really wonder at what point does the violence have to occur to have that triggered in a Donald Trump administration. And I don't think we know the answer to that question. And pretty much I don't think he did either when he answered the question today. So stay tuned on this. Luckily, it looks like some of the riots have dispelled in L.A. and it's starting to quiet down. So hopefully it won't matter in this instance. But I think it's definitely a page to watch.
Interesting as we learn more about some of the folks who were arrested, Jeanne. Isn't that interesting? We're not hearing very much about what went behind these arrests. In some cases, there were violent criminals. We heard about a handful of them, but we're learning more now as well about, for instance, Juan Fernando, detained by ICE at his job at a clothing factory, transported back to the country he had left behind without much time passed. I mean, the same day he was pulled out of his job and immediately deported. His family is asking for due process. Are we going to go through this all over again with this group like we did with those deported to El Salvador?
I think we probably will. The reality is Donald Trump deserves credit for shutting the border. We need common sense immigration reform, and it is neither cost effective nor enforceable for the United States to deport people who have been here, many of them brought as young people, for their entire lives, who are working and paying taxes, to pick them up at Home Depot or, like you're talking about, these people. Criminals, absolutely. But that was part of the DACA. And Donald Trump had embraced some of that in the past. Now he is being pushed by the likes of Stephen Miller, as is ICE, to deport 2,000 to 3,000 people per day. That means you go to peaceful tax-paying people who, by the way, are paying taxes and helping our economy. It is not a common sense solution to a real crisis and problem we've long had. And the president should be called out for not working with Congress to get a deal done. This is the same person, for electoral reasons in January, blew up, much to the dismay of Republicans, a very strong immigration bill that could have moved us forward. That's what Americans should be alarmed about.
Well, when we consider immigration-related legislation, though, Rick, the White House in recent days has been very quick to point everyone to the fact that the One Big Beautiful Bill working its way through the Hill right now does include funding for more ICE agents, more customs agents, more Border Patrol agents. How does that factor into the overall likelihood of the bill sailing through, or at least getting through easier, shall we say?
Yeah, I would say the one item that has not generated much controversy at this point in time in the Big Beautiful Bill, the reconciliation bill, has been money for the Homeland Security and for Department of Defense and their portion on things like building the wall. So the reality is this is one there most Republicans have been jumping on board. It's gotten some criticism for being a big spending item. And we just talked to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Basically, from what I could tell, what he was saying is we've cut enough, don't need to cut any more. And so probably no appetite in the House side, I guess, to go after those funds. But the reality is it's a significant over $300 billion commitment at a time when border security seems to be handled pretty well. And so It's really deportations. And I could just add, there have been more deportations in the first year at this point in time in the Biden administration than it is today. Donald Trump's deporting fewer people. So it's not the issue of deportation as it exists. That's happened throughout all the administrations. It's the tactics under which they're using the deportation rules to their advantage.
Well, it's a really important point to make. Rick, it's kind of ironic, Jeanne. You remember the big argument was, do we do this in one big, beautiful bill? That's why we call it that, because the other option was to break it in two. That was the John Thune option. Get the border money out the door, and we'll spend time on taxes and the rest, which will be more difficult to debate. Well, here we are. One big, beautiful bill was the answer. And it's kind of ironic that based on current events, it is, in fact, the border component that could help push this over the finish line, isn't it?
Yeah, it's ironic, or it is something that the the administration helped to sort of push forward. But the reality is,
this is all part of the plan, is what you're saying.
I don't know, but I'm not sure it's ironic. But the reality is that this bill funds the border. That is fine. But what we need is immigration reform. We have 6 to 7 million people in this country. The government doesn't even know, they can't tell you, who were brought here as babies and children. Are we really going to pick these people up, take them to a place or push them out to a place they've never been and know nothing about while they have done nothing wrong? Very few Americans support that tactic. We have to find a common sense pathway to citizenship. Yes, close the border. Yes, fund border security. Yes, deal with people who are committing crimes. But yes, also find a common sense way to keep people who are working and contributing in this country, especially people who were brought here, who work with many of us, and we know many personally. They are friends, neighbors, and family members. They are here and they should be supported in an effort to stay here and to continue contributing to this great country. That's where the president's plan here and Stephen Miller's, quite frankly, falls very short.
Rick, in our final minute, your degree of confidence that that common sense solution can be found in the near term?
Well, I certainly worked hard enough with John McCain to try and have a comprehensive immigration bill passed, and didn't work out so well. But it is the way to actually have all these jobs that people are getting deported from to be filled with people who actually come in legally. And of course, I think there's a broad bipartisan support for legal immigration reform. And it's just not the administration that's likely to pass it. But it would be a very good thing in the heels of this current debate to be contemplating if you're the Trump administration.
Talking about motivations here on both sides of the aisle, Jeanne, would it help Democrats if this did not fizzle out and in fact spread to other cities as we consider messaging ahead of the midterms?
Maybe politically, but, I think many Americans are tired of thinking about this from a political lens. I mean, we need solutions. Yeah. And so, if it helps Democrats, that's fine for Democrats. But it doesn't help the United States as a whole not to treat people the way they should be treated and to keep people brought here as children here, contributing to society and making us the best we can. So I think that's also important, as in addition to the political end.
All right, Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors in our political panel on this Tuesday. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power, and we'll have more ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We are here in Washington, where we're bracing for news on a couple of fronts here. Most immediately, a Rules Committee meeting in the House that starts about 20 minutes from right now. Kailey, they could bring changes to the president's so-called big, beautiful bill before they have to be addressed in the Senate. This is kind of an interesting moment as these two chambers try to reconcile their differences before this blows up into a big public spat, because once the Senate finishes its work, sends the bill back, it could be a little different by then. Yeah, because the Senate is going to be informed by the decision-making of the Senate parliamentarian, which will actually rule what does constitute a budgetary matter and what doesn't, as there were a number of provisions in the original House bill that maybe won't pass muster on that front. That's just some of the work, of course, that the Senate has underway. There's other tweaks they want to make to the bill as well, regardless of whether or not they are truly budgetary in nature. And
Earlier today, our colleague David Weston, who of course hosts Wall Street Week on Bloomberg, had the chance to speak with one sitting U.S. Senator who just joined the chamber this year. The Republican senator from Pennsylvania, David McCormick, sat down with him for an interview at the Union League Club for the Economic Club of New York earlier today. Here's part of their conversation.
The people that I met on the campaign trail were voting for change. They wanted change. They wanted an economy that worked for them, that worked for working families. They wanted trade policies that they felt were fair. They wanted a border that was secure and didn't sacrifice their families.
Cool.
And that's the agenda that I largely ran on, which was to help working families build opportunity, fair trade, not free trade. I was someone who negotiated with China 20 years ago for free trade deals, and I'm now one who believes that we need to be focused on reciprocity and fairness. We can talk more about that. People that wanted the border closed, wanted law and order, and essentially wanted their fair shake. And so if we talk about the big beautiful bill, we talk about the border policies, we talk about trade, we talk about immigration. The framing of the policies starts, I think, with those experiences in Pennsylvania. And I'm about 150, 160 days into the job, so I'm still figuring it out. But I would say I'm very, very privileged to be able to do it. I'm the 54th elected senator from Pennsylvania, but I think I have a unique perspective because I now have learned what's going on the ground in a way that I had grown away from since I left for West Point. And I also, as I said, I have some perspective as someone who sat in this room with all of you. So I'm delighted to have a chance to share that today. Honored to be here. And David, why don't I turn to you and you can take it away.
Okay, Senator, thank you so much. That was very helpful to set up. So let's pick up on exactly what you talked about and what you learned from traveling all around Pennsylvania for the working men and women, if I can put it that way, and particularly people who are not having an easy time of it. What makes this bill beautiful? It's big. There's no question it's big. But what makes it beautiful for them?
Well, I think the starting point for this, and it's in some ways very advantageous to the people in this room and to them, is that if we don't pass the bill, we have the largest tax increase in history. And so, there's lots of media around this, but essentially, if you look at the bill, if you're a family that makes $50,000 a year, if we don't pass this bill, your taxes go up by $2,000 a year, $2,500. So it affects everybody. The large majority of the tax benefit for individual rates, 60% of it goes to people that make $400,000 or below, despite the fact that 80% of the taxes are paid by the people that make 10% or at the highest end of the 10%. But in addition to that, it's very pro-growth.
Senator David McCormick, the Republican from Pennsylvania at the Economic Club of New York, with Bloomberg's David Weston. Just another look at this reconciliation effort that's underway right now, and as we mentioned, could provide news later on today. Of course, Kailey, part of the narrative that's come around this reconciliation bill, something we talked about with our panel and with Jason Smith of the Ways and Means Committee, what's happening right now in Los Angeles, the attention that it's driving to the president's immigration policy could actually help to hasten the passage of this bill because it includes billions of dollars to help at the border.
Yeah, and specifically to have more personnel for ICE, for customs, for border patrol agents as well. That is the messaging that the administration is pushing out there, that what we're seeing take place on the West Coast just adds to the urgency of making sure that this legislation passes.
A lot of questions about what's happening in Los Angeles. We did hear from President Trump earlier today, live in the Oval Office, speaking with reporters. He said if he didn't mobilize the National Guard and the Marine Corps, Los Angeles would be obliterated and would be burning to the ground now, which is quite remarkable based on some of the optics that we've already seen isolated to a corner of Los Angeles. Wanted to get into the grounds, though, for deployment and some of the other language that we've heard with Elizabeth Wydra, Constitutional Accountability Center president and Supreme Court litigator. Elizabeth, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you. The president has suggested that these troops were needed, absolutely, the National Guard and the Marine Corps were needed to essentially put down a rebellion. Does he have the legal standing, as long as they're on federal property, to keep them there as long as he wants?
The deployment itself is the problem. We have very specific guardrails in the United States to make sure that we live under a civilian authority, not military rule. And so if the president wants to deploy the military, if the president wants to deploy the National Guard without the consent of state and local leaders, there are only extremely specific, rare circumstances under which he can do that. That's invasion. There's no invasion. That's rebellion. There's no rebellion. And if the state and local authorities are unwilling or unable to execute the laws. And we have not seen that the case. The LAPD, state and local authorities, they believe that they were perfectly capable of dealing with the mostly peaceful protests. Yes, there were some instances of violence and destruction, which are abhorrent, but the vast majority of people were exercising their constitutional right to protest. And the deployment of the military and the National Guard is unlawful without any invocation of the Insurrection Act. The president did not have the authority to do what he did, and it wasn't needed on the ground, according to the state and local leaders whose views matter in these circumstances.
Well, I'm glad you raised the Insurrection Act, Elizabeth, because the president was asked directly about that in the Oval Office earlier today, knowing that the military personnel currently deployed do face limitations on the conduct with which they can engage. They can't act in a law enforcement capacity. The Insurrection Act, though, if the president decided to take that step, would give them that power. How should we consider what qualifications need to be met for President Trump to actually declare that an insurrection is underway?
Well, I think there might be close cases of that. I think this one is not one of those close cases. You have people who are protesting immigration raids that they find outrageous, that they find to be an intrusion on their community. Instead of focusing on violent criminal people who are here without authorization, they're rounding up our neighbors and community members who are just trying to work and support their families. So the people are rightfully expressing their outrage and mostly peacefully protesting. So this is not one of those close cases where you're like, is this an insurrection or is it not? And I think the really disturbing message that we're getting here from the deployment of the National Guard and the military is that it does seem as if President Trump is using the military in unprecedented and frankly unlawful ways to further his political agenda. We certainly saw on January 6th, which I think you could make a very good case that there was an insurrection there with the attack on the Capitol. There was a request for National Guard support, and President Trump did not provide that, arguably because it didn't support his agenda. But here, where you see the deployment when people are protesting actions that his administration is taking, that is very disturbing because in America, we don't do that. The military is not supposed to be politicized. It's not supposed to be weaponized to use to pursue a particular agenda or not. Whatever political party you belong to, we should all as Americans be able to agree on that.
Elizabeth, we're hearing from immigrant advocacy groups about some of the folks who have been detained and arrested that led to the protests. We haven't spent much time talking about any of their cases because we don't know that much about them. But apparently many were detained even though they did not have a criminal record. And one particular case came to light in the Washington Post, that of Juan Fernando, who was pulled out of a clothing company where he was working in Los Angeles and was deported so quickly. His parents say they did not have time to get an attorney. It's a pretty remarkable story. He, in fact, thought he had signed a consent to a coronavirus test, but may have inadvertently signed off on his own deportation, was told to cross an international bridge back to Mexico, and was not allowed back. Is this legal?
It definitely doesn't sound legal or in accordance with due process to me, without knowing more of the facts, of course. But that's part of the problem. And that is what people are protesting. As a Southern Californian myself, our communities are full of people who are hardworking immigrants, some who are unauthorized, who don't have papers, but they are hardworking members of our community. And I think that's why you're seeing the protests in the streets in Los Angeles, because these raids happen in the garment district, like the case you just mentioned, to workers who are gathering outside Home Depot to try to engage in labor to support their families. And that's why you're seeing people come out in the streets, because this is not what they want their government to be doing, to be targeting these members of our communities.
Well, and when we consider that that is an effort that has been underway and a primary goal of this administration, Elizabeth, we know that they have run into some difficulty in the courts, including a Supreme Court, which has ruled that due process needs to be afforded to many of these individuals. Have you seen direct evidence to this point of the Trump administration directly flouting the courts when it comes to immigration-related directives?
So we have seen that the actions in court are working to put up the guardrails that the Constitution and the law puts forth. I want to be totally clear that people understand due process applies to every person in this country. There are some rights under the Constitution that apply to citizens. Due process expressly applies to everyone in this country, citizen or not. So it's incredibly important for our constitutional democracy to work to ensure that everyone, including people who are immigrants here, including people who are undocumented immigrants here, get the due process that the Constitution requires. It's part of the foundation of the United States. It's guaranteed in the Constitution, and the courts are ensuring that that happens. And we can only hope that the Trump administration continues to follow court orders and that these guardrails continue to hold. But the people who are going out and saying, this is not what we voted for, are making an important point. They're raising their voices as the Constitution allows them and protects their right to do so.
All right, Elizabeth, we appreciate you joining us here on Balance of Power. Elizabeth Wydra, Constitutional Accountability Center president and also Supreme Court litigator herself, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. That, of course, one story we continue to follow, and we could hear more from President Trump about what's going on in Los Angeles later this afternoon. We should note, Joe, that he's currently traveling to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and is expected to make remarks from there around 4 p.m. Eastern time. He could weigh in on this, but also perhaps have a status update on trade negotiations underway in London as we speak.
That's right. We could have some breakers there, too. This could be an interesting afternoon here in Washington. The president was asked, by the way, he's at Fort Bragg celebrating the Army's birthday, asked about potential protests at the big Army birthday parade here in Washington on Saturday. He did say that there would be no patience for protests at that event. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. We'll meet you back here for the late edition at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, as always on Bloomberg TV and radio.